Oops. Can we get by here? No. Can we? Sorry. Thank you. אפשר לקנות את המים? לדקה? אני אחזיר. אומנם. אני אחזיר. אוקיי. נצביע? אוקיי, אני אחזיר. סליחה.
Morning, everybody. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Steven Windmueller here and Michelle Windmueller, of course. Because Steven Windmueller, unofficially, started this what has now become a formal series 2 years ago. It was the first lecture on changing Jewish communities, which we had in an attempt to return to the days when the center was really leading the world in this field. And Steven gave a lecture, an excellent lecture, which stood by itself. But finally we have been able to start this year and to raise at least some funds for an ongoing series of lectures. And we will likely publish Post-Holocaust and Anti-Semitism, which you can take there free. There are issues standing there. We will start a series of publications on the same model on changing Jewish communities. I also want to make 2 announcements about upcoming events. The next week, the Tuesday, the 28th, at 10 o'clock, Karol Schrack, the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, will speak here about changing Jewish attitudes in the United States toward Israel, which is based on a publication he has just published, which the American Jewish Committee has just published. So next Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then it is now 5 years that the founder of the center, founding president, chairman of the center, who built the center, Professor Daniel Elazar, passed away. We were at his grave a few weeks ago. And we will have the annual memorial lecture for then on Sunday, the 23rd of January we start at 7:30, the official is a reception, and at 8 o'clock. It will not be here, it will be in Mishkanot Sha'ananim. And Richard Joel, the president of Yeshiva University, will speak about the future of Jewish education. So, well, it's now my pleasure to introduce Steve. May I show the book? He's just published this, American Jewish Committee. Again, we have suddenly 2 lecturers who publish works at the American Jewish Committee. You shall not stand idly by, a Jewish community relations workbook. Steve told me a very, very pleasant thing, sorry for interrupting myself. Steve said that the piece he wrote for the Jerusalem Center on the shift in Jewish voting toward the Republicans, it was in our Jerusalem Viewpoints series, is probably the most publicized piece he ever wrote. And we are proud that apparently what we are doing makes sufficient impact to be ranked like that. Steve will speak to us in trends in Jewish political advocacy in the United States. Steve is the director of the Hebrew Union's College School of Jewish Communal Services, which was once called the Daniels School as far as I recall, and he's an adjunct associate professor of Jewish Communal Studies at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. Steve.
Good morning, Boker Tov. I'm most appreciative to Manfred and to Elizabeth for arranging for me to be here, and to Harriet for joining us, because Dan Elazar was indeed a mentor and someone who clearly inspired my writing and work in many ways, and to a number of you in the room who each of you have intersected with my life and career, and that of Michelle, my wife, who joins me this morning. This is a missing book. It was ordered for you this morning so that you would have copies to be able to sort of follow along the bouncing circle. Unfortunately, somewhere between New York and Jerusalem, this is in transit, as they say. But I would be pleased to pass this around because it may give you some insights in the context of what I'd like to talk about this morning. And hopefully, if this does interest you, you will take occasion to seek it out in terms of ordering it through the American Jewish Committee. So we will just arrange for it to be passed around. When one decides to write a publication that tries to reflect on a discipline, in this case the discipline of American Jewish community relations, it often is the question of what is the motivating factor or factors that leads to such a publication. No doubt a piece of that story is that my wife began her PhD program 5 years ago, and she said, "So what are you going to do over the next 5 years?" So I needed something to do, and she inspired me to sit down and to address the question of really putting together a discourse on the nature of Jewish community relations in the United States. Its publication, in a sense, coincides with the 350th anniversary of the American Jewish experience, 1654 to 2004. And as a result, a piece of this is as much about the celebration, if you wish, of the American experience. Some of its unique characteristics, as well as some of those points in time that have fundamentally shaped how American Jews intersect with the larger public culture, the civic culture. The book is designed in part to reflect both the content of the field, that is, what is this about that is called Jewish community relations, and how does one go about, in fact, carrying that out as a discipline through strategies, tactics, goals, and programming. It is also a reflective piece in the context of putting this field in relationship to the larger story of the American Jewish experience and where Jews intersect with the public culture. I was particularly struck in the work that I was doing on this that there was really little from which to base my research. Truly, many people had written on particular themes: church and state, anti-Semitism, Israel advocacy, the history of anti-Semitism, questions related to world Jewry, issues of Jews and civil rights, notions of social justice and social action, principles related to interreligious dialogue, questions of Jewish ethnic relationships. But very little had been spent on how this field was shaped and the role of the institutions that helped to frame the field, and to look at the kind of evolution of both ideas and content that would construct truly a discipline which took its name in the 1940s as Jewish community relations. Prior to that, the field was basically identified as public affairs or public relations. And even earlier, it was simply known as a kind of Jewish defense, the protection of Jews and their welfare. I would begin this morning in focusing on some of those critical moments, not all of which are shaped in this book, but are part of my thinking about the field, that tell this story of the American Jewish political advocacy experience. Some of you may know these tales, others of you may find them particularly fascinating. In 1790s, on the election of President Washington, the American Jewish community would have its first challenge. How would they craft a joint letter of Mazel Tov to the first American president? And from the outset, we learn the initial experience of the American Jewish community that they could not agree on a single letter of Mazel Tov. So each of the congregational communities, the 6 major Jewish communities at the time, prepared their own letter. The letter of the Jews of Newport is particularly important, Newport, Rhode Island, because in that letter and in George Washington's response to them, there already becomes a part of the so-called contract. And this I take from Dan Elazar's work on the notion of contracts in Jewish life and Jewish political behavior, where Washington specifically references that for the first time he would hope that Jews would live freely and comfortably, each under his fig tree, not fearful or afraid that in this society, free of the role of government and imposing on Jews or any group a kind of authority or anti-Semitic policy. It was a framework in which Jews would suddenly realize that this was a different kind of experience, where the White House, beginning with this very simple letter, expressing itself in terms of the principle of safety and security and welcoming of a community. It would be reflected again in 1862 in an incredibly fascinating set of events that would occur over a very brief period of December of 1862 into early January of 1863. Ulysses S. Grant was United States commander and general for the Union forces in the Tennessee River Valley. This is prior to his assuming the overall responsibility for the Union Army in the Civil War. In moving his forces into the South, he realized that many Jewish business persons were conducting their business as peddlers, selling and trading with their neighbors. And he realized that they would have access to the movement of Union armies and could easily share that information with Confederate military sources. He therefore issued Order Number 11. Order Number 11 is the only example I have found in American Jewish policy and practice, of government policy and practice, where the United States specifically singles out Jews and specifically does so in a very negative way. In Grant's order, he simply orders that all Jews residing in the Tennessee River Valley be relocated from that region. Immediately, the Jewish community mobilizes itself, and this is one of the very first occasions in which American Jews would think about the notion of protecting their self-interest and dealing with a principle of advocating for themselves. In a letter to Lincoln, within 1 week of this order, the communities from the South as well as the North, in one of the more interesting points of collaboration between Jews from both sides of the conflict, petition Lincoln to rescind this order. By early January, Lincoln has rescinded Order Number 11, and in the process not only gains a great deal of popularity and support with the Jewish community, but symbolizes the fact that the community could mobilize and organize and defend itself, and thereby create an environment in which there was a sense of self-protection. These kinds of experiences loom in American Jewish history. An example of the Central Conference of American Rabbis early on speaking to the question of church-state separation, with Isaac Mayer Wise leading that charge in terms of speaking about religiously neutral schools, and the notion that the schools of America, the public schools of America, ought to be, in a sense, sanctuaries of Americanism, and that religion was a privatized kind of notion, and begins to build the first core arguments for separation of church and state. The framework of early American Jewish advocacy for Jews abroad, from as early as 1840, but throughout the entire period of the 19th century, letters being addressed to both American political leaders, but also to European leadership, reflecting the concerns of American Jews for the welfare of Jews, whether they be in Damascus, or in Italy, or in Austria, or in Russia. The point being that Jews began to realize that they had an opportunity to create vehicles by which to express themselves as part of the interests of advocacy for Jews abroad, and ultimately those tools would be used for Jews at home. The first effort at community organizing in 1859 was the effort to create the first framework of a community national institution, the Board of Deputies of American Israelites, taken from the British model of a community of advocacy and organizing that would project the kind of voice for what American Jews would need to do, both to defend their interests and those elsewhere. It is interesting that between the period of 1906 and 1917, this entire field of Jewish political advocacy would take on a kind of institutional framework. From the birth of the American Jewish Committee in 1906, which was built and created around the principle of advocating for Jews as a result of the 1903 Kishinev pogroms and the voice that America needed to play with leadership abroad. Or the creation of the Anti-Defamation League in 1913 around an American-based issue of the lynching of Leo Frank. And then finally, in 1916-1917, the creation of the American Jewish Congress to become a kind of advocacy of Jews in terms of building a Jewish state and the Zionist movement. It is interesting that these three groups are more than simply advocating for these particular causes and interests, but they reflect very different styles of political behavior and structure. The American Jewish Committee, by its very name, tells us a great deal about the notion of elitism and the notion that Louis Marshall and Jacob Schiff and the sort of upper New York crowd of the East Side crowd of New York to create a leadership of elites who would speak on behalf of American Jewish interests. Or those who would look at the American Jewish Congress and see the Congress as a counterpoint to this, of the Lower East Side community, speaking about grassroots community organizing, and about the fact that they would represent the democratic and community-based and socialist and Zionist interests of a different Jewish community that would speak through the venue of a Congress of Jews. Very different models of organizing. And the ADL reflecting the principle that it was a voice of B'nai B'rith, America's oldest Jewish institution, to speak specifically to the issues of domestic concerns with regard to the well-being of Jews in the United States. But this was a system that was grounded and based beyond institutions. It was framed in many ways around a series of principles. Those principles are still very much in the central sort of mindset of American Jewish thinking. An 1892 court case in which the Supreme Court suggested that in fact America was a Christian nation raised some very interesting principles about the church-state question, a question that continues to be a principal piece of the American Jewish political agenda. American Jews have constantly dealt with this question in various forms, and in the book a good deal of attention is placed into the different streams of thinking about church-state policy and practice. And that continues to be an issue even today in terms of the question of charitable choice and vouchers, and issues with regard to whether or not religion should be seen in the United States as a public or private notion, and what ought to be the role of the American Jewish community in expressing itself in these questions. The second of these sort of core issues has to do with the principle of progressivism. This idea that initially was sort of seen in the 1890s as reinventing the American experience in urban settings and recreating voices, the hidden voices of new immigrants, and allowing people to have control over their own destinies in American cities and cultures and communities, would carry on in a context about how the Jewish community would itself become a kind of voice for political change, for social justice, for civic engagement. And those progressive themes were tied by the Reform movement specifically to the principles of prophetic Judaism and the linkage between the ideas of social justice and the American principles as expressed in this progressive movement. A third of these principles was born out of the notion that in the 1930s America was changing and the world was changing, and that American Jewish groups began to think in terms of group self-interest in very specific ways. As ineffective as the American Jewish community would be between 1933 and 1945 in terms of delivering outcomes, it nonetheless created the infrastructure and the framework by which American Jews would later become particularly skilled and highly organized to carry forth political interests on behalf of Israel, the fight against anti-Semitism, the notions dealing with preserving the memory and experience of the Holocaust in Jewish practice and ideas. Another one of these principles that seems particularly significant was that we were looking at an idea of America as a multicultural society, where people such as Will Herberg would speak to the question that Jews ought to see themselves as equated and equivalent with Protestants and Catholics, and thereby to politically position themselves as a piece of the story that had the same weight and same credibility as the other major religious streams in America. If Herberg focused this issue on religion, then others would focus it on culture and politics, and thereby creating the notion that Jews could fully engage in the political process by using their influence to not only shape policies that were good for American Jews, but would ultimately deal with the question that a society that was not engaged politically, knowledgeable about issues, engaged by voting, and committed to the principle of advocating was a society that was problematic for Jews, because Jews would thrive and grow in those kinds of environments in which the society, in fact, participated fully in shaping public policy and influencing political outcomes. American Jewish politics as such, that is, the ways by which these major agencies, and there are multiple numbers of them, would be to construct a kind of national framework of policy that was focused on 5 or 6 core areas. Clearly, the first of these was on the notion that to protect interests of the Jewish people, one had to be defenders of that community. The whole focus on the fight against anti-Semitism. The second of these principles was centered on the notion that America thrived best in an environment in which religion and state were viewed as separate, and maintaining that wall of separation was seen as critical. To that concept, I must tell you that the American Jewish Congress in 1945 literally reinvented this battle. Prior to 1945, American Jews looked at this as a kind of general idea of what the society should be like. But it was the Congress, and it was Leo Pfeffer, and David Pedagorsky, and others who basically said that if the Congress and the American Jewish community was to be singularly successful in this, it would need to enter into court actions, into legislative advocacy, so that the Congress would lead the American Jewish community to fundamentally see itself not simply on the sidelines, speaking to these questions, but literally to move into the courts, to move into advocacy in the Congress, and to see itself as really heavily engaged in the political process. This was a totally new idea that ultimately was taken over by the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League and others, but it was to the credit of the American Jewish Congress to begin that process. It was Congress also that began the process of figuring out a way in which you mobilized the community, realizing the failures of the period 1933 to 45. Congress began to think in terms of how do you develop within American Jewish communities systems of political engagement. And they began by creating regional offices and constructing a kind of connecting point between a New York national system of advocacy and a community-based system of involvement. Other principles here that are particularly significant suggest that in the 1950s, the American Jewish community was suddenly taken aback by the fact that for the first time in its 20th century experience, it would really see itself being challenged in ways that it had not felt before by three factors. The emergence of a Jewish state ultimately created questions for the American Jewish community about its relationship to that state. And most of these agencies were relatively slow in understanding this connection and in looking at ways by which the Jewish community was to advocate or participate with the Israel experience. Some of you are familiar with the exchange between David Ben-Gurion and Jacob Blaustein on the basic question of simply defining the diaspora-Israel relationship. Blaustein, as president of the American Jewish Committee, was deeply concerned about the dual loyalty charge that would be directed against American Jews in the post-1948 period, and thereby began to construct with Ben-Gurion a set of letters that focused on this question to help clarify the relationship. A second piece to that was the story in terms of the rise of communism and the development of the Soviet Union and the impact of whether Jews would be seen as loyal to the United States or friendly to the communist regime. The Rosenberg case clearly was the highlight point of this in the 1950s, but it was simply symptomatic of the larger question of how Jews would be perceived. Were they loyal to the United States? And those who had been interested or active in communist front organizations in the 20s or 30s, would they now be brought up on charges? And would that create an environment of serious questioning of the well-being and status of American Jews? A third example of this was, of course, the civil rights movement. Early on, Jews began to struggle with how public they should be in this question, in terms of defending the rights of blacks, and in becoming engaged in questions of social activism with reference to the politics of America's cities. These three issues, Israel, the question of communism and American Jewry, and the issue of the civil rights movement, would shape much of the early pieces of this infrastructure of the American Jewish political system. But very quietly, corresponding to all of this, sitting in Washington, was the first effort to create a voice for Israel in the American political advocacy movement. Cy Kennan in 1954 began to think about the notion of creating a voice that would lobby for Israel through what he called AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. While AIPAC is legally chartered in a very different way under U.S. legal construction, it is a 501c4 corporation, which allows it to lobby. All of the other institutions we've been talking about are C3 corporations, which limit the extent of their lobbying and advocacy capacities. In creating a lobbying voice in Washington, we began to see something that would evolve, especially in the post-1967 period, and take on a life of its own to become one of the most significant factors in American Jewish political activism, the role of Jewish engagement with Israel around public policy questions in Washington. There are a series of interesting principles about this field. Institutions that are successful in a particular area will find that they are radically and rapidly copied by other institutions, because this is a field that generally moves collectively and not singularly.